one thing I think atonement theology does for us is it really forces us to come to terms with the impossibility of totally describing the ineffable, the divine, the God. Um, One of the things that Colin Gunton points out in his book, The Actuality of Atonement, he points out the fact that we don't really have a way to speak. I mean, we can talk about God. There is such a thing as God talk, and we do believe that we can accurately say things about God. But one thing that we need to recognize is that we're not going to completely or fully describe God. Um, we can be accurate, but we will never be complete, and that's just because of the kind of being that God is. God is beyond. Aquinas has a notion about the way that when we say something true of God, there are an infinite number of things that we still have not accurately said about God. No matter what we say, there's always an infinite amount that can be said more about God. Whatever we don't say about God, there is an infinite amount of things that can be said about the ultimate that still have not been said. This kind of thinking I think is valuable. I think it's probably true, but I also think that it can lead to despair. It's led to after the linguistic turn in the 20th century, a lot of philosophers of language, especially those who follow in the tradition of Martin Heidegger, have ceased even attempting to speak about God. So, for example, you'll have Ludwig Wittgenstein, who he has this line near the end of his final treatise on philosophy of language, where he says something like, and after that, let us be silent. He says we can accurately describe things about us, right? We can talk about experiences that we've had. This is the philosophy of phenomenology, if you're interested. That we can accurately talk about our intentional states, what we think, what we believe, and all of that. We can even say probably things about the world that we live in. But once we get to the transcendent, once we get to the divine, we should just be quiet, because there's just no way for our words really to get purchase on the actuality of who God is and what is ultimately real in the universe. And so at a point, a phenomenological theology, if you want to call it that, is either a theology of negation, where all we do is we just rule out different things and we can say that's not God, or it becomes something highly mystical, where it's simply it's simple silence, it's simple reflection. It really draws deeply on, in some ways, the various Christian and non-Christian mystical traditions. That strikes me as a little bit too pessimistic about what we can and can't say about God. I think it undermines the notion of God's intervention in the world, God's and for those of you who follow kind of my some of the stuff that I've sort of promoted, something of God's immanence in the world, something like Moltmann's panentheism. God's present here. God's not that far off. I think that notions like that tend to be a little bit too Bardian, a little bit too positing too much difference, not giving God enough credit for having been involved in human affairs. All that to say, there's a lot going on there theologically and philosophically. What it should instruct us, though, we should take this away. We are not going to be definitive about God. Nothing we say is going to be definitive. We can say true things, and we can have confidence in those things, but they're not definitive, as in discussion ended, we have exhausted everything we need to say about God, let's move on to the next topic. Once theology gets to that point, it has grossly overestimated A, the power of our language, B, the power of our cognition, and it has C, grossly underestimated the nature and character of the triune God. Good theology does come to a place where it says, all right, now we've entered into the realms of speculation, mystery, the transcendent, ineffability, the categorically beautiful. Whatever you want to say, there has to be a place where language has to stop and awe has to begin. And atonement theology is especially instructive in this way because it's one of the places where our source documents, if you want to think of it that way, which you probably shouldn't, but if you think of the tradition and especially the Bible as kind of sourcing our theological language, you see that what we have with Scripture is variegated and inconclusive. In some ways, it seems like it might be a little bit incoherent, and that should instruct us. It points us. It really focuses us, lasers us onto the fact that we can't. There is a limit to what we can say. There is a limit to what we can know, and this actually is one of the things I think personally lies beneath one of the modern some of the modern uncomfortability with religion, and especially Christianity, because Christian theology takes very seriously the notion that at a certain point human beings need to shut up, and that is something very anti-modern, anti, the can-do spirit. We're going to figure everything out with science and all that. There's something about that kind of humility that Christian theology demands that is not en vogue, and I think that's a good thing. I think that's one of the ways in which Christianity demonstrates its necessity and its superiority, because it can incorporate the sciences. We talked about that earlier in the quarter, but it also is willing to be quiet and be in awe when the time for that comes.